Greetings and thank you for allowing me to speak. My name is Dowin Boatright. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Emergency Medicine here at the Yale School of Medicine. And today I'd like to briefly discuss the state of diversity in medical education. In particular, today I'd like to talk about some of the past efforts that have occurred nationally to increase diversity in medical education. Spend some time discussing the current state of diversity in medical education, and then finally reflect on future challenges to diversity. But before we do, I'd like to spend some time just reflecting on why diversity is important in medical education and in the healthcare workforce. There's several arguments. One of the most common arguments is the economic argument. This is based on the idea that teams that are diverse perform better than homogenous teams, in part because teams with a diverse background are better able to problem solve and come up with creative solutions to difficult situations. This is a study that was recently published in the McKinsey Quarterly that actually wanted to test whether or not this idea bore out in reality, in particular, looking at the top 180 publicly traded companies in France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States. In particular, they defined diversity in these companies by the gender diversity in the senior leadership of these companies and also by the racial ethnic diversity of the senior leadership in these companies. And what they found was that companies that were in the top quartile compared to companies that were in the bottom quartile for diversity performed significantly better in terms of profit margins, with the companies in the top quartile diversity generally on average having 14% greater profit margins than those in the bottom. While the economic benefits of diversity are going to be important for all of us, as physicians, I think we care more about the healthcare benefits of diversity. And there are several benefits there that have been well documented in several studies. One of the most recent of which was in 2014 by Marast. And when he investigated primary care physicians and their levels of diversity, what he found was that physicians of color care for approximately 53.5% of all patients of color. Moreover, minority physicians care for approximately 70.3% of all non-English speaking patients. Moreover, this study found that physicians of color are much more likely than their white peers to care for patients from low income. In particular, Black physicians were almost twice as likely to care for patients reporting low socioeconomic status compared to their white peers. Additionally, physicians of color are more likely to care for patients with Medicaid. Consequently, diversity in the healthcare workforce has significant influences on both the access and the quality of care given to our patients. In addition to benefits to patients, diversity also has been shown to impact the quality of medical education. In a study of medical students from both Harvard and Stanford, 84% of students stated that the diversity of their student body enhanced student discussions. 77% reported that the diversity of the student body enhanced their understanding of various treatment options. 86% reported gains in understanding alternative viewpoints. And 94% of students reported that the diversity of their class enhanced the overall educational experience. An additional study published in JAMA in 2008 also looked at how the diversity of the medical student body actually influenced only white students. In particular, data was taken from the Association of American Medical Colleges graduation questionnaire and specifically looked at student responses only from white students. In particular, looking at two questions: how students self-rated their cultural competency, and also self-rated their attitudes towards access to care, in particular, whether or not healthcare was a right. What the study found was that as white students categorized by the level of diversity in their class based on the percentage of underrepresented minorities, as that level of diversity increased, white students were more likely to rate themselves as having high cultural competency and also more likely to report that healthcare was a right. The conclusions of this study were that the diversity of the student body actually created a learning environment where students were more thoughtful and had more egalitarian attitudes towards healthcare. And one of the last arguments, and my personal favorite argument, is an argument from social justice. And this argument just states that all students, all individuals, regardless of their background, are entitled to a learning environment where they can thrive and participate equally in their learning environment and be physicians. And this brings us to the current state of the physician workforce diversity. What you can see in this graph from a study from 2015 is that when we look at the percentage of women, both in the United States and in the healthcare workforce, and we look at the percentage of underrepresented minorities, both again in the United States and in the healthcare workforce, what we find is that women and underrepresented minorities are underrepresented at every phase of the healthcare workforce, such that although women make up slightly more than 50% of all citizens of the United States, female physicians make up less than 50% of medical students, even fewer trainees in graduate medical education, and just about 30% of all independently practicing physicians. While underrepresented minorities make up 30% of the United States, underrepresented minorities make up just about 15% of all medical students, about 13% of all residents in graduate medical education, and less than 10% of all practicing physicians. And the question is, how exactly did we get here? When we look at the percentage of both women and underrepresented minorities in medical school historically, we can see that there have been dramatic changes. In 1970, less than 10% of all medical students were women, and less than 3% were underrepresented minorities. We can see significant gains over the years. However, of note, you can tell that most of those gains are concentrated among women, with relatively stagnating gains among underrepresented minorities. Nevertheless, these changes are important, and it's important to reflect upon the national initiatives that were responsible for these changes. In particular, I'd like to draw your attention to this graph, which was produced by Dr. Herbert Nickens as he prepared for his notorious Project 3000 by 2000. The goal of this project in association with the AAMC was to matriculate at least 3,000 underrepresented minority medical students by the year 2000. And what Dr. Nickens has done here is he's divided the percentages and levels of diversity of both the United States population and medical school matriculants into three distinct phases. The first phase here represents a period of dramatic gains in the diversity, the racial ethnic diversity of medical school matriculants. In particular, you can see that in 1968, just slightly above 2% of all medical school matriculants self-reported their race ethnicity as underrepresented minorities. By 1974, those gains had dramatically increased to just about 10% of all medical school matriculants. Dr. Nickens attributed this gain to the sensitivity to racial injustice occurring during this time and the civil rights movement. However, you can see during this phase two that Dr. Nickens has identified, during this time, the percentage of underrepresented minorities in the population of the United States continued to increase. Nevertheless, the percentage of medical school matriculants that identified as underrepresented minorities was stagnant. This stage remained until what Dr. Nickens describes as phase three, and this was marked by the Project 3000 by 2000. This period in particular was marked by significant partnerships between medical schools and their communities, in particular high schools and colleges, to identify talented individuals from underrepresented backgrounds and help their matriculation into medical school. While Project 3000 by 2000 didn't actually reach its goal of matriculating 3,000 underrepresented minority medical students by the year 2000, the period did experience significant success. However, as we look beyond Nickens, we can see that unfortunately, those gains were not persistent, and the percentage of underrepresented minorities that matriculated not only stagnated, but actually began to decline. And those declines have been attributed to several legal challenges to affirmative action, including ballots challenging affirmative action in states such as California, Michigan, and Washington State, in addition to various Supreme Court challenges, especially the 2003 case of Grutter versus Bollinger. These declines in the percentage of underrepresented minorities matriculating to medical school persisted until 2009. And that was when the Liaison Committee on Medical Education, the accrediting body for all MD granting institutions, decided to intervene. Prior to 2009, the LCME had two diversity accreditation standards. Of note, the LCME's diversity standards occur in two broad categories. One category uses the phrase should, the second category uses the phrase must. Categories that use the phrase must demand accountability on the part of medical schools, and if the medical schools do not comply with those standards, they risk losing their accreditation or being placed on probation. For categories that use the term should, it is advised by the LCME that medical schools adhere to these policies. However, if the medical school were to fail to meet that standard, there would be no substantial or material repercussions. However, in 2009, the LCME updated its diversity accreditation standards with the phrase changing from should to must, such that medical schools now must have medical education programs in place to develop partnerships aimed at broadening diversity among qualified applicants for medical school admissions. In addition, an institution that offers a medical school education program must have policies and practices to achieve appropriate diversity among its students, faculty, staff, and under other members of the academic community. While many medical schools initially struggled to meet these diversity accreditation standards, data from a study that we published in 2008 does show the accreditation standards did have significant implications for the ultimate diversity of medical school matriculants. This first figure here shows the percentage of women that were matriculants to medical schools from 2003 to 2018. As you can see, from 2003 to 2009, the percentage of women that were medical school matriculants actually was in a state of decline by about 0.29% a year. In 2009, when the diversity standards were first introduced, you can see that decline continued, but it slowed from 0.29% a year to about 0.19% a year. Nevertheless, in 2011, just 2 years after the diversity accreditation standards were introduced, you can see that that trend reverses dramatically, with gains in the percentage of women matriculating to medical school increasing by about 0.84% a year, such that by 2018, women actually represented more than 50% of all medical school matriculants. You can see similar gain, or a similar pattern at least, among Black medical school matriculants, although on a much smaller scale. From 2003 to 2009, the percentage of Black matriculants was actually in a state of decline. Again, that decline stopped in about 2009, and in 2011, you can see that trend reversed, such that the percentage of Black matriculants increased by about 0.28% per year. While the percentage of Hispanic matriculants was on the rise before the diversity accreditation standards were introduced, you can see that that trend actually almost doubled in 2011 from 0.18% increase a year to 0.35% a year. When we look at Asian matriculants, we can see that the percent of Asian matriculants plateaued after the diversity accreditation standards were implemented. And you can actually also see that the percentage of white matriculants actually declined after the diversity accreditation standards were introduced. In fact, in this report from 2008 from the Association of American Medical Colleges, the AAMC noted that for the first time ever, women were the majority of both applicants and matriculants. This report also noted significant gains in the percentage of American Indian and Alaska Native matriculants, in addition to gains for Black or African American matriculants. I think it's important to reflect upon the implications of the diversity accreditation standards, and I think we can draw two conclusions. The first being that increasing diversity is possible, especially when institutions are sufficiently incentivized. I know that I've constantly heard from many leaders in medical schools that increasing diversity is challenging in part because the pool of talented applicants is just small. There aren't enough underrepresented minorities. However, I think we can see that when we review the data in terms of the percentage of matriculants, both before and after the diversity accreditation standards were introduced, we can see that the pool of talented applicants was probably significantly larger than was imagined. Moreover, you can see that diversity is not a zero-sum game. Many people have stated that diversity efforts are often futile because if one school introduces diversity efforts and interventions, all that school is really doing is stealing maybe a matriculant from another school. So if Stanford, for instance, were to introduce a pipeline intervention, all they'd technically be doing is taking an applicant that could have potentially gone to Harvard. But I think what we can see here is that medical schools not only were able to increase the percentage of underrepresented minority applicants, they did that in a period where the number of slots for applicants also increase, such that not only did the percentage of medical students increase, but the number of underrepresented minorities increased as well. I think the lessons we've learned from the LCME diversity accreditation standards have important implications for graduate medical education as well, and emergency medicine in particular. Starting in the 2018 academic year, the ACGME, or the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, released its own diversity accreditation standard, drawing language mirroring the LCME diversity accreditation standard, such that now all residency programs will actually be responsible as well for having partnerships with their sponsoring institutions to engage in practices that focus on a mission-driven, ongoing, systematic recruitment and retention of diverse and inclusive workforce of residents, fellows, and faculty members. Whereas previously, members of the graduate medical education community did not really have to think about diversity, all institutions will now be held accountable or be at risk for losing their accreditation. And again, this is particularly important for emergency medicine, which has historically struggled in terms of racial and ethnic diversity, as well as gender diversity. As you can see here, that women have historically represented at most just a little bit over 30% of all practicing physicians in the field. And now I think it's important to reflect upon the future of diversity in medical education. In particular, we are now in a period similar to phase 3 that Dr. Nickens identified in 1994, where we've seen gains, although modest, gains nonetheless in the diversity, the racial ethnic diversity of medical school matriculants. And the question remains, will these gains continue? Will we undergo a period of stagnation similar to phase 2? Or worse, experience a period of decline, such as the period from 1994 to 2009? To gain a better understanding of the challenges for the future of diversity in medical education, I think it's important to reflect upon the lived experience of minority medical students. And my group of researchers here, we decided to do this through 3 particular studies. One study looking at the way minority medical students are perceived in medical school. A second study looking at the way minority medical students are valued in their medical school community. And finally, a study looking at how medical students are treated. For the study looking at how medical students are perceived, we decided to evaluate the medical student performance evaluation, more commonly known as the Dean's Letter. We decided that this will be an important document for a variety of reasons. One, the Dean's Letter is a fundamental component of all applications from medical students applying to graduate medical education. In fact, most medical students will be unable to actually receive a residency interview without this document. Moreover, not only does the letter include language from the dean of the medical school, but it also includes language from members of the medical school community, be it that medical students' peers, supervisors such as residents and faculty as well, and in a way kind of gives a voice that reflects how that medical student was perceived during the medical student's career. We obtained, to conduct a study, a data set of 6,000 medical students and their medical student performance evaluations, or Dean's Letters. These medical students came from 134 medical schools across the United States, applying to 16 different residency programs, all at one academic medical center here at Yale. In particular, again, our data set contains 6,000 medical students. About 45% were women. About 7% self-reported their race to be Black, 4% their ethnicity Hispanic, about 26% reported their race to be Asian, and 55% white. Again, these demographics are very representative of US seniors nationally. Our data set in terms of USMLE step scores was slightly higher than the national mean, with a slightly higher percentage of students reporting to be members of the Alpha Omega Alpha Honor Society, or coming from schools in the top 40 of NIH funding. We then took those Dean's letters and used natural language processing to identify words from some very basic word categories that had been studied in performance evaluations previously. These categories being standout words such as best, excellent, outstanding, ability words such as talented, grindstone words such as hardworking, and also words reflecting compassion such as empathetic. What we found was that white medical students, especially when looking at the standout words such again as exceptional, best, outstanding, bright, white medical students were significantly more likely than Asian, Black, and Hispanic medical students to be described by these standout words, with the exception of the word competent, in which Black medical students were more likely to be described with this word. Although competent technically is part of the standout word category, we felt that the term was almost like a backhanded compliment. Additionally, when we looked at differences by gender, we found that women were much more likely to be described as caring, compassionate, or having empathy when compared to their male counterparts. In a subsequent study in 2009 that was published in the journal Journal Internal Medicine, investigators looked at performance evaluations from clinical rotations in medical school. They stratified their data set by whether or not the student self-reported to be a member of an underrepresented minority group, and further stratified these evaluations by whether or not the students received honors in the clinical rotations or a grade of pass. They then looked and created a word map of how these students were described. And what you can see in this word map is that underrepresented minority students compared to their peers are described by a much smaller list of descriptive words. And this even applies to underrepresented minorities who obtained the grade of honors. So what we've seen in these two studies is not only are white students much more likely to be described with standout words, but even the vocabulary used to perceive underrepresented minorities is smaller compared to their non-underrepresented minority peers. We then decided to do a second study to evaluate how underrepresented minority medical students are valued. To do so, we decided to examine membership in the Alpha Omega Alpha Honor Society. The Alpha Omega Alpha Honor Society was created in 1904 and has since grown in prestige, such that membership in the society now represents the hallmark of academic excellence and achievement while in medical school. To date, the AOA Honor Society has included over 150,000 inductees. These inductees include 75% of all United States medical school deans, 50 Nobel Prize winners, and 11 of 19 surgeons general. Moreover, membership in the Alpha Omega Alpha Honor Society is associated with future success in academic medicine. Members are more likely to pursue a career in academic medicine. Members are more likely to obtain the rank of dean in medical school, the rank of professor, or the rank of chair. Consequently, it is important to investigate whether or not any racial and ethnic disparities exist in membership. If so, this could be a structural barrier limiting diversity in the healthcare workforce. Members are selected by a few guiding principles. These guiding principles are created by the National Honor Society and then spread to individual chapters. In particular, the National AOA Society states that of a medical school class, only 25% of individuals are eligible for membership. Generally, eligibility is designated by academic performance in the term of grades. Although 25% of a class is eligible for membership, ultimately only 16% of the class will be selected as members. This selection process is supposed to be determined by medical students' capacity for leadership, dedication to professionalism, and also service to both the medical school community and the local community of the medical school. And consequently, again, our research question was, what is the relationship between race, ethnicity, and AOA membership? Again, we used a data set of medical students coming from 134 medical schools, applying to 12 residency programs in this case, and again, to one academic medical center being Yale. Our initial data set included 5,239 applications. We removed all applicants coming from medical schools that did not have an AOA chapter. And we also removed all applicants from schools from historically Black colleges or universities. Finally, we removed any applicants who did not self-report their race or ethnicity on their residency application form, leaving us with a total of 4,655 applications. Again, from those ARIS applications, in addition to race ethnicity, we obtained demographics including age and applicant sex. In addition, we identified proxies for AOA selection criteria, including the number of hours dedicated to leadership activities, the number of hours dedicated to community service, and also a proxy for professionalism, which we actually identified as gold humanism membership. Additional academic variables included whether or not the applicant had a master's degree, a PhD, USMLE Step 1 scores, in addition to the number of publications listed in the application. In terms of our sample, again, our study cohort very closely mirrored US seniors nationally. And again, further data showing that our study cohort was very similar to US seniors nationally. Key differences being our study cohort actually had a slightly higher percentage of students reporting to be members of the AOA Honor Society. And again, a slightly higher percentage of students coming from schools in the top 40 by NIH funding. What we found was that members of AOA were significantly more likely to have USMLE board scores in the top quartile compared to non-members. Interestingly, though, we found no difference in the hours dedicated to leadership or community service between AOA members and non-members. When we looked at the likelihood of AOA membership by race ethnicity in our unadjusted model, we found that medical students self-reporting to be Hispanic and Asian were about half as likely as their white peers to be members of the Honor Society, while medical students reporting their race to be Black were almost 1/8 as likely as their white peers to be members of this Honor Society. In our adjusted model, again, accounting for demographics, AOA proxy measures, in addition to USMLE step scores, we found that Asian medical students remained almost half as likely as their white peers to be members of the Honor Society, whereas Black students had odds almost 80% less than their white peers of being members of this society. And this racial ethnic disparity in AOA membership has significant implications for the healthcare workforce. From this chart, you can see the impact that AOA membership makes, especially when we look at fields that have traditionally been deemed to be very competitive when selecting for a match. In particular, if you look at the field of dermatology, AOA members have a match rate of 81% compared to 50% for non-AOA members. In orthopedic surgery, AOA members have a 95% chance of matching compared to just 75% for non-members. While we see this and these implications for the workforce in the specialties traditionally considered very competitive, we also see a benefit to being an AOA member even in fields not traditionally considered competitive. In this chart, looking at the match rate just among students scoring the highest quartile on their USMLE Step 1 exam, you can see that AOA members have a 100% match rate in internal medicine versus 94% for non-members. In pediatrics, 100% again for AOA members versus 97% for non-members. In emergency medicine, our own field, AOA members have a 98% chance of matching versus 92% for non-members. So here we can see what has become an institution embedded in undergraduate medical education, being the AOA Honor Society, has significant racial and ethnic disparities that have significant implications into potential careers and opportunities for members based on their racial and ethnic identity. And these implications have not gone unnoticed. In this article from NPR, published in 2018, you can see that this story identifies Mount Sinai as a medical school that actually decided to suspend their AOA selection of medical students secondary to the racial and ethnic disparities. In particular, Mount Sinai noted that over the last 20 years, there'd been less than 5% of their AOA members were from underrepresented backgrounds. So we've looked at two studies thus far, looking at how medical students are perceived and valued in undergraduate medical education. I want to conclude with one study looking at how medical students are treated while in medical school. In particular, we wanted to explore the experience of microaggressions. Microaggressions is a term originally coined by the psychiatrist Chester Pierce. In particular, microaggressions represent subtle, in many cases, nonverbal debasements of any member of a minority group. These microaggressions or these um, derogatory interactions can be both intentional and non-intentional, but regardless, communicate some type of derogatory um, interaction towards a member of a marginalized community. As an example, in 2015, Harvard did um, a photo voice session just identifying the experience of microaggressions among its medical students in a project known as I2M Harvard. In this particular case here, you can see a Harvard student who's a Black man with his headphones on with a sign that says, "No, it's not rap." Moreover, here are some young women, again, Harvard students with signs, just kind of expressing some of the microaggressions they experience, such as, "You don't speak Spanish," or "No, where are you really from?" Or these men with signs saying, "You don't act like a normal Black person," or "You're not like the other Black people I know. You speak so well." So the goal of our study, while microaggressions have been well documented both in the interactions that people encounter on a day-to-day basis and also among institutions of higher education, the prevalence of microaggressions is poorly known in undergraduate medical education. And we wanted to get a better idea of this prevalence. Moreover, we wanted to have an idea of how microaggressions impact or influence the wellness of medical students, in addition to their overall medical school satisfaction. To do so, we created an adapted survey of microaggressions based on the validated racial and ethnic microaggression scale. To do so, we adapted this previously validated scale to better suit the climate of academic medicine and pilot tested it among 20 diverse medical students here at Yale, in addition to representatives from the Student National Medical Association, the Latino Medical Student Association, um, in addition to APAMSA. Survey questions were then modified and adapted based on the pilot data and responses from our pilot participants. We ultimately identified 14 microaggressions, and I'll just give you a sample of 4 here so you can get a better idea of the survey. Some of the microaggressions included: people are surprised by how well I speak English. People mistake me for someone else who shares an aspect of my identity. People imply I was admitted to medical school for reasons other than academic merit. My ideas are ignored, but others are applauded when they say the same thing. If a medical student reported that they experienced any of these microaggressions, they were then asked how frequently they experienced the microaggressions on a scale from never to almost daily. If a medical student reported they experienced these microaggressions, they were also asked why they thought they experienced them based on some aspect of their identity. These sources of attribution included multiple aspects of identity, such as race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, religion, and sexual orientation. Our study cohort ultimately included approximately 832 medical students. And as you can see, these medical students were from medical students across the country from very diverse backgrounds based on race, ethnicity, with an oversampling of students of color. Again, we identified 2 outcome measures. One was an outcome measure of wellness, which we identified based on student responses to the patient health questionnaire 2, which is a validated survey instrument to screen for depression, and also questions related to medical school satisfaction adapted from the business literature. What we found in terms of microaggression frequently, just as Chester Pierce had previously hypothesized, the experience of microaggressions was very common in our cohort, with at least 50% of our cohort experiencing a microaggression at least once weekly, about 25% of students experiencing microaggressions almost daily. The most common source of attribution for microaggressions among our cohort were gender, race, and age. Although our survey was a quantitative measure, students were able to fill out a comment section in which many students actually listed some of the microaggressions they experienced. And I just wanted to share a couple with you. One student wrote, "I had an older male physician as my first year mentor. I shadowed him every other week in his clinic for my Intro to Clinical Medicine required course. He would regularly introduce me to patients as a pretty face to talk to while you wait." Another student wrote, "I choose to wear my hair in its natural state sometimes." And some of the professors made a comment, "Did you get electrocuted?" After that comment was made, him and another professor proceeded to laugh. So again, to better understand how these microaggressions are associated with student wellness, we decided to quantify each frequency of microaggressions by just assigning a point to that microaggression and aggregating it and totaling it for each medical student. We then sought to see how that total quantification of microaggressions was associated with the odds of a medical student screening positive on the PHQ-2 screen, again, a screen for depression. And what you can see here is a very clear dose-dependent response, such that as students reported more frequent microaggressions, they were significantly more likely to screen positive for depression, such that students in the highest quintile for the experience of microaggressions were almost 7 times more likely to screen positive than students in the lowest quintile. When we looked at medical school satisfaction, just to simplify the analysis, we divided students into two groups. Essentially, we divided students into one half that experienced microaggressions either at least once a week or almost daily. And this again represented almost 50% of our sample. And then we divided them into a second group that experienced microaggressions less frequently. We identified these groups as the higher exposure group and the lower exposure group. And what we found was that students in the higher exposure group were less likely to report that they would recommend their medical school to friends. They were less likely to consider their current medical school for residency training. And they were less likely to report that they would donate to their medical school after graduation. Furthermore, students in the higher exposure group reported that they more frequently missed class during medical school, that they were more likely to consider transferring medical school, and were more likely to have considered withdrawing from medical school than their peers in the lower exposure group. Here you can see that the implications of the study that one, just as Chester Pierce again hypothesized, the experience of microaggressions, at least in our study cohort, was very frequent, and that students that had a higher experience of microaggressions were more likely to have screen positive for depression, have poorer wellness, and more likely to consider transfer or withdrawal from medical school, which could have significant implications for the future diversity of the healthcare workforce. So again, in these three studies, we gain a greater idea into how medical students are perceived, valued, and treated while in undergraduate medical education. And again, while the diversity accreditation standards from the LCME have experienced modest success in increasing diversity, clearly much work remains to make the climate of medical education both inclusive and equitable for all medical students. And again, this also has significant implications for emergency medicine in all residency programs in graduate medical education, as now all programs will also be held accountable for both their level of diversity and their climate for accreditation purposes. Moving forward, again, there remains much work to be done for graduate medical education. I think moving forward in terms of future areas of research, we still need greater understanding of evidence-based interventions that can actually increase the racial ethnic diversity in graduate medical education while also making the climate more equitable and inclusive. I want to thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak on this topic today.